Okay, well, welcome to this webinar. This is on Xojo's remote debugger. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm the founder and CEO of Xojo. And the remote debugger is not about debugging your TV remote. It's about using Xojo's remote debugger, which is an application that can let you debug your application from the IDE, but have the app running on another computer or in another operating system. And I'll show you how that works. So in this webinar, we're going to cover what a remote debugger is, talk about what operating systems and CPUs it supports, how you configure it. I'll do a quick demo. And we'll talk about debugging to remote computers, because that is also possible. And then we'll answer any questions. All right, let's dive in. So what is it? Well, first of all, when you typically debug, you're debugging on in the IDE just on your machine. You're running the IDE and you're debugging on the same operating system on the same computer. That's just typical debugging in Xojo. When you're remote debugging, the IDE is running on one computer with a particular OS, in this case, let's say Mac OS, but you can then be debugging to other operating systems like Windows, Linux, even other versions of Mac OS if that's what you need to do. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, typically, these other operating systems are running in a virtual machine, like on Parallels. That's the simplest way. And that's the way I'll be demoing. But they could conceivably be on another computer entirely. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, there are two remote debuggers. There's one for desktop and one for console. So you can remote debug desktop and console applications. Now, what operating systems and CPUs does it support? Well, for Linux, we support 32-bit and 64-bit ARM and x86. So ARM there means you can run on Raspberry Pi, for example. You can remote debug to Raspberry Pi. For Mac OS, it's 64-bit only, and again, ARM and x86. And for Windows, 32-bit and 64-bit ARM and x86. With a little caveat about ARM. On ARM, Windows is running in emulation mode, or rather the remote debugger is running in emulation mode. That's at least as of right now. I'd say it's likely at some point in the not too distant future, we'll have it running natively for Windows on ARM. Now, how do you configure it? Well, first you have to install it. So if you've never dealt with this before, you just go to the Xojo folder on your computer, go to the extras folder inside of that, and you'll find two folders, one for Remote Debugger Console, one for Remote Debugger Desktop. And it'll have all of the different compiled versions of the Remote Debugger for the specific operating systems that are supported. In the case of the desktop, the version that is for the machine you're on will typically not be compressed. You can see in this case, I'm on a Mac, so Remote Debugger Desktop, that's the Mac version. So grab the version you need and then install it in the virtual machine or on the computer that you're going to remote debug to. Now, next you need to launch it and configure it. When you launch it, it's going to bring up its options window. In this case, I'm showing the version on Windows. You give it a name. Now, this is the name that's going to appear in the Xojo IDE. So, make it descriptive. If you want to use a password, you can give it a password. It's going to choose a location where it's going to download and install the file. Because basically what's going to happen here is when you run, it's going to build a debug version of your application just like it does for normal debugging, but it's going to send it over to the remote debugger virtual machine or computer and install it. And wherever it's going to install, it's going to be in that location listed here. Now, usually for network preferences, you don't need to touch this. The network interface is in case you have multiple interface cards in your computer and you want to use one specifically. The port is the port we normally use, but if you need to change that, you can. Max connections is how many apps can connect to a single remote debugger at once. I've never had a need to change that. I don't think you will either. Public is whether or not you want it discoverable by the IDE. And you'll see in a minute how we set it up in the IDE when I do the demo. And then once you've set those simple things, you click OK. Again, most of this is just setting the name and the password. That's usually all you need to do. All right, so let's see it in action. So let's see. I'm going to Stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to share my application window, and let's go over to Xojo. Okay, so I've got a Xojo project here. This is my DB kit. This is something I write that's available for Xojo. And I'm going to go to settings so you can see where you set this up in settings. You'll go to settings and then you go to debugging, and you'll see you've got remote debug hosts. And I've set up one called Geoff Windows, one called Geoff Linux. Again, the names are arbitrary. Do whatever you want there. And it's pretty simple. You click add, and if you made it public, it'll show up here. Otherwise, you just fill in the name of the machine, the IP address, the password if there is one, and you click OK. And then it'll show up in this list. And then the way you run to that machine or VM is you simply, oh, and before I run, let me switch over to Windows. So here we are in Windows. I've got the remote debugger app here. It's already installed. And I just double click it. And it's going to show me this simple pane indicating the name, the address. So that's where you can get the IP address if you're not sure. It tells me it's listening and it's ready to go. And there's a checkbox, launch executable after receiving. Now, why wouldn't you always want to launch it? Well, if you have a special situation where you need to make changes to the executable, maybe there's files you're including, maybe you're going to move it to a different location, whatever, you may want to launch it manually. So if you uncheck that checkbox, you'll need to launch it manually, but otherwise it's going to launch on its own. All right, so we'll go back to the IDE, and I'm going to go to the project menu. And instead of clicking the run button, I'm going to go to the project menu. I'm going to choose run remotely. You can see the two remote debuggers I've set up. You can have as many as you want, but these are the two I've set up. I'm going to choose Geoff Windows. And like usual, it's just going to go ahead and build. It's going to transfer and launch. Once you get to a white screen and you don't get an error or anything, then you know it's already launched on the other the remote machine or VM. So I'm going to switch back to Windows, and there it is. There's my app running, and I can open this up, and it's just normal debugging like you would do. I'm testing my app. That's great. Now let's say I want to put in a breakpoint and step through the code. Well, all I have to do is switch back to Xojo. It's just like you would do it normally. There's the greatest thing about this is that there's nothing particularly special about how it works, or to put it a different way, what you have to do to use it. You pretty much just do debugging the way you're used to doing it. So I'm going to go into DB Kit, and I'm going to go find the list box, and I'm going to go to the selection changed event, and I'm just going to put a breakpoint here. And then let's switch back. We're back in Windows. And when I click on another row, the selection changed event will fire, and we should get the breakpoint. And sure enough, it fired, it brought the IDE to the front, and there it is. And we can just step through the code like we would normally do. And we can, look at variables. And, again, it's just like normal debugging. It really is that simple. So you can do this on Mac OS, on Windows, on Linux. For Mac OS, if you need to test, and this is also true for Windows and Linux, if you need to test on specific versions of operating systems, then you can use something like Parallels to create a virtual machine and install a very specific version or a certain configuration. Maybe you're having trouble with an OS when it's configured a certain way. Whatever you want to do, this is where virtual machines are really, really handy. And we support pretty much any virtual machine that you can install, as long as it can, run your Xojo app and launch the remote debugger. It should work just fine. I like Parallels because it's just really easy to use. But again, whichever one you want to use on Mac, Windows, or Linux will work really well. Okay. And by the way, if you have any questions, just put them in the questions pane. We're going to get to that in a second. Okay, so now let's go back to our presentation. And let me share that. Okay, now, most of the time, you're going to debug to a virtual machine on your computer. That's the most common way the remote debugger is used. but you can debug to a remote computer. If you had a situation where you just could not reproduce a problem a user was having, it only happened to them, it only happened on their machine, and you just were really struggling to figure out why your code was breaking, you could install the remote debugger on their computer, have them launch it, give you the IP address, and then you could log into it. So this is debugging to another physical computer. Like I just said, it requires installing the appropriate remote debugger. And if they have a firewall on their computer, or rather, if you have one, you'll need to, on your computer, you'll need to open port 44553 for UDP and TCP, and open port 13897 for TCP connections. Now, if the remote user is on the same network as you are, it's really easy because you just type in the IP address and it's just going to work. It's really, really simple. It's almost as simple as using a virtual machine. However, if it's on a different network, let's say they're in a different office from you, whatever, then it's a little more challenging, but not too bad. What you'll want to do is use a virtual private network. Two examples are Zero Tier and Tailscale. They both have free service tiers, which work just fine. So you set up an account with them, you get on the virtual, you install the software on your machine and on the other computer machine so that you can log into the virtual private network. And once you do that, then you're effectively on the same network. So then you just treat it the same. You get the IP address, you type it in, and to the remote, from the remote debugger, add it to your IDE, and away you go. Now, I knew this was going to be a short webinar because remote debugging is actually really easy, but it's also very, very powerful, which makes it great. I mean, that's what we try to do at Xojo. We try to make things that are powerful and easy to use at the same time. We don't think that you need to make a trade-off there. I am going to see if we've got any questions. Let's see. Okay. More. Here we go. Q&A. There we go. Okay. All right. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So that's good because, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward, honestly. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to thank you for coming. Again, it was a short webinar because this is a really easy to talk about topic. And if you do have questions about the remote debugger as you try to use it, go to our documentation because there's lots of documentation about the remote debugger. You can also send questions to support. You can ask on the forum. We really encourage you to utilize the support forum. The remote debugger is one of those tools where when you need it, it's great that it's there. You probably won't need it very often, but when you do need it, it's just wonderful that it exists. And yeah, it's just a great tool. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again at another webinar. Bye-bye.